As we begin, I just want to read something about the letter of Hebrews before we begin to examine who it's written to, who it's written by, and then we're going to close by actually looking at it, not just talking about it. A man by the name of John MacArthur writes this. He says, "In this epistle, everything is presented as better. We have a better hope, a better covenant, a better promise, a better sacrifice, a better substance, a better country, a better resurrection, a better everything." It says Jesus Christ is presented here as the supreme best. And we are presented as being in him and as dwelling in a completely new dimension, in the heavenlies. We read of the heavenly Christ, the heavenly calling, the heavenly gift, the heavenly country, the heavenly Jerusalem, and of our names being written in heaven. Everything is new, everything is better, and this book convinces us that we don't need the old. In fact, I think that's one of the main themes of Hebrews. I know that I was encouraging people to read through it in the previous week, and some of you did, and some of you started, and some of you have still more chances to read. As we read it, I think one of the major overwhelming themes that we'll see in it is just that theme of better. And if I had to put Hebrews in one sentence, one short sentence, it would just be, Jesus is better than everything. And in fact, Hebrews is a book of 13 chapters. The word better is used 13 times. You can't get far from this idea of the supremacy of Christ. It's more of a fancy way of saying Jesus is better than everything. It looks better on a slide. We see the word better is used 13 times. We see the word perfect is used 14 times. And again, the writer of this book is telling his original hearers and us today that there is a world, there is a reality that is more real and more powerful and more attractive than anything that we can see or touch or taste right now. That Jesus and heaven is better and perfect. More the longing of our souls, and we'd be foolish to settle for anything less than perfect and the better of what Jesus has to offer his people. So even as we heard those first 4 verses being read, I was already blessed just by hearing it read. And before we begin to examine those verses, being as this is the first sermon in a series that's going to go for a long time, this is the time when we need to look at some of the questions of when was the book written, who was it written by, who was it written to, and all these sort of things. It's somewhat important because it colors how we understand the rest of it. Who originally received this letter? We know that it wasn't written to us. In a sense, we are reading someone else's mail this Sunday. But it's okay. I think it's a crime otherwise. But when God sends a letter, he wants other people to read it as well. And so who originally received this letter that we have in front of us? Well, from the early era of the Christian church, this book, this letter, has been called the letter to the Hebrews, the epistle to the Hebrews. And that's a title that's been given to it. And it makes a lot of sense to see this was written to men and to women who come from a Hebrew background, who come from a Jewish background. The author of this letter assumes that they're very familiar with the Old Testament. In fact, in the book of Hebrews, we see more Old Testament references than any other New Testament book. More than Matthew, more than Revelation. We see more quotations of the Old Testament here in Hebrews than any other place in the New Testament. There's concepts and themes that they'd be familiar with that the author doesn't explain much because he assumes they're already familiar with it. And now, 2,000 years later, it's my job to explain those things that they would have known instantly, but we're separated so far from it. We see that the original recipients, the original hearers of this, would be not just from a Hebrew background, but followers of Jesus. And followers of Jesus that needed to be reminded of the supremacy of Christ. of the fact that Jesus is better and greater than anything around them. And what the writer does is he contrasts the religious system that they grew up in, the religious system that they were perhaps saved out of, and says, but Jesus is so much greater. In the past weeks, I've been reading this book over and over, and I've been trying to read it in one sitting at a time, in multiple sittings, repeat it over and over and over again. Again, I advise, give it a shot. It's good. However, and I've also been reading the book of Hebrews. I've been reading loads of books about Hebrews. And, it's a bit of a mystery who it's addressed to. We know that, yes, they were Jewish, but where were they? We don't know. The two major potential, or the two major proposed locations would be Jerusalem, because that's where we're going to find most Hebrews, or Rome. And I'm not going to get into it, but I lean towards that these were Jewish men and women who were living in Rome at the time. And if you care, I can tell you why I think that. It's not super important, but I have footnotes that I could talk to you about if you care about that sort of thing. I believe that these are Jewish men and women who are from Rome, living in Rome, and this letter is sent to them as they are a bit discouraged, to encourage them in their faith. The city of Rome is a giant city even to this day. In its time, in the first century, a population of more than 1 million people, which is a really big deal for the first century. It is the biggest and most important city in the world. It rules the world. And out of these 1 million plus people, there are about 5,000 Jews that live in Rome at this time. I'm not that good at math, but I think that's about 5%. Or 0.5, I don't know. Not many. There's a small minority of Jews that live in Rome at that time, living out their Hebrew faith, living out their faith in the God of Israel, contrasted to just the complete paganism all around them in Rome. And so they live as an isolated minority within Rome. Some of those Roman Jews in 33 AD would have gone on their pilgrimage that they were required to take from Rome down to Jerusalem for the Feast of Pentecost. Jewish men were required to go to Jerusalem for these feasts. And so some of them would have gone from Rome down to Jerusalem to celebrate the Feast of Pentecost. And at that Pentecost feast in 33 AD, some of them would have heard a sound like a mighty rushing wind. And they would have rushed, and they would have run to this odd sound that they heard. They would have seen Peter and the other disciples glorifying and speaking of how great God is. They were able to understand in their own dialect what he was saying of the wonderful works of God. And then they would listen as Peter would preach and communicate about how the Old Testament scriptures promise of a time when God the Son would come down, when he would usher in a new covenant, a new way of life, where he has come from glory to shame, when he came and paid the penalty for sin upon the cross, and then was glorified. And then the Spirit has been sent down for those that trust in Jesus. They would have heard that. And then I'm sure that some of these Jews from Rome would have believed and would have accepted the offer that Peter extended and would have responded to his charge to repent and be baptized in the name of Jesus for the forgiveness of sins. I know this because in Acts chapter 2, it gives a list, and it says that there's people from Rome that are there. And so they go, and then some of them, I'm sure, stayed in Jerusalem. And Acts 2:42 says that they stayed there and they committed themselves to the apostles' teaching, to the breaking of bread, to fellowship, and to prayers. And would have joined that Jerusalem church, maybe for the rest of their lives, maybe temporarily. I know that some of them, however, would have gone back home to Rome with their newfound faith in Jesus as the Messiah. As the coming one, they'd say, well, he has come. And I have repented, and I have trusted, I've been baptized, I'm a Christian. And so they leave maybe the the bubble or the thriving, growing church in Jerusalem back home to Rome. And excited and filled with the Spirit, they share their faith, they evangelize to their friends and their families, they plant churches in the city of Rome. And it's a very, very exciting time as the gospel is spreading, even to the very capital of the world. Very exciting. But now, decades have passed. It's been probably around 30 years since those maybe initial exciting days of revival and renewal, and seen exciting things happen. And they are evidently growing a bit discouraged. Perhaps because there's such a small population in the midst of such a big city. Perhaps because they really felt like they didn't fit. Last Sunday, as Shane was preaching, he was talking about how all who follow Christ are elect exiles. That in a sense that we don't fit wherever we are. But perhaps especially so for this group of Hebrew Christians in Rome. They already were an ethnic minority. They already were looked down on by all the Romans as being Jews. And now they were looked down on by all the Jews as being heretics, as being Christians. And so they are cut off from so much of their city. They are tempted to drift away. They are discouraged. They are weary, and they wanted rest. And they're no longer, some of them, they're not holding fast to the confession of their hope as they once did. So we're seeing this church, this group of people, they really need a word of encouragement. And so this letter is written to them just as that.